Welcome to On Point. I'm your host, Roger McConnell, and I'll be here every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. with topical shows addressing the needs and concerns of military veterans and active duty personnel. I'd like to introduce my guest today, the Wing Commander at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Colonel Rob Stanley. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to visit with us today.
You're quite welcome. It's my honor.
And can you start off by listing your specific duties at Malmstrom?
Well, I am the Wing Commander of the 341st Missile Wing, and we have just about 4,000 men and women in uniform and civilian government employees who work on our nuclear deterrence mission here at Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is keeping 150 Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles ready to launch on a presidential order.
That's a big task.
It is. It is.
Now, just out of curiosity, when did you join the Air Force?
Well, I was commissioned in December of 1988 out of Purdue University in Indiana, and the Air Force at the time was going through the Reagan drawdown, and so we weren't brought on active duty right away, and I got a call while I was working in a factory trying to make ends meet, waiting on the Air Force to bring me on active duty. And it was a military personnel center out of Randolph Air Force Base, and a Captain Bill Bromley, and he said, "Lieutenant, would you like to go to Sicily?" And I said, "Well, is that in Illinois?" And he said, "No, it's not in Illinois, it's in Italy." And I said, "Well, hang on a second, let me ask my wife." And I just got married, and I said, "Hey, Cheryl, there's this captain from Texas, and he says we could go to Sicily." And she said, "Is that in Illinois?" And I said, "No, it's not in Illinois, it's in Italy." And she said, "Well, heck yeah." And so I was assigned as a ground launch cruise missile crew member, and our job was to take these mobile, the Navy calls them Tomahawk cruise missiles, the Air Force called them Griffins. They had thermonuclear warheads on them, and we had armored tractor trailers that were camouflaged, and we would go out for up to 30 days in austere environments and hide from the Soviets and be ready to launch cruise missiles on presidential order. And we were also trained to, right, we were trained to fight the Soviet special forces, which were called the Spetsnaz, and be able to get our cruise missiles off the ground. But that was May 1989.
Did it ever come to any hostile fire?
No, it didn't. It didn't. The Cold War was one of those things where you were constantly tense, but both sides knew that there really was a lot more to lose than to gain by going to war. And so we served our purpose.
That's right. Deterrent.
That's right.
There you are. Now, how did you decide on the Air Force over the other branches of the service?
Well, actually, my dad and I were doing janitorial work in Kokomo, Indiana, and fairly poor family. I was adopted when I was 2 days old. Mom and Dad were much older. They were 47 when they adopted me. And my mother was from Scotland, and she wanted to trade a winter coat and a plane ticket at Heathrow for me. And so Mom and Dad gave her a winter coat and a plane ticket back to Heathrow, and she gave me up. The judge signed off on it. And so Mom and Dad and I, just the three of us, fairly poor. And as I got older, I helped Dad doing janitorial work. And we had a particularly bad bar we were cleaning one morning on a Sunday. And this was probably about 1982. And Dad said, "You need a college degree." And I said, "Dad, we can't afford that." And he said, "Well, you got good grades, put in for scholarship." So I did. And then I wasn't hearing back from any universities or anything or the services. And we had a friend who said, "If you join the Army, you can get your school paid for." So a bunch of us decided we're going to join the Army and go into artillery. And we did the ASVAB testing and all those things, and they gave us a date to come back in and raise our right hands and get sworn in. And that date, I went out to my little 1977 Chevette, started it up, and the engine died. So I called one of my friends and said, "You're going to have to come by and get me this morning." Well, while I was waiting on him, I went down to get the mail, and when I was coming back up to the house, I opened up this one from Air Force ROTC, and it said I'd been awarded a 4-year scholarship. And so I ended up going in the Air Force and went to Purdue University, which was just about 50 miles down the road from our house. So that's how I chose the Air Force. It kind of chose me, I think.
A Chevette chose the
That's
Air
right.
Force.
That's right.
What other duty stations have you enjoyed in deployments before you came to Malmstrom?
Well, gosh, like I say, I started out in the 302nd Tactical Missile Squadron in Comiso Air Station, Sicily, which doesn't exist anymore. Then was put into Strategic Air Command when they shut down the Ground Launch Cruise Missile Unit, and so I went through Vandenberg Air Force Base just for 6 months of training, and then to F.E. Warren Air Force Base. And then after F.E. Warren Air Force Base, SAC had been shut down, and we were merged in with Air Force Space Command, so I became a space launch guy and went to Cape Canaveral, where I was a launch control officer for the Delta II launch program. After Cape Canaveral, I went to Headquarters Space Command at Peterson Air Force Base. Then I went to school at U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island. After that, I went to the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies at Maxwell Air Force Base down in Alabama. And after that, I was on Headquarters Air Force staff working space launch issues at the Pentagon. And then to Warren Air Force Base, again, where I was DO or operations officer for my old missile squadron from the SAC era. And then I became a squadron commander there at Warren Air Force Base. And then back to the Pentagon, where I served on the Joint Staff. And then after the Joint Staff assignment, I went to an organization in downtown D.C. for a year called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then here to Malmstrom to be the Vice Wing Commander. And then I took over the wing on February 8th of this year.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much.
That's quite a resume.
Yeah, it's gone by like lightning.
Well, I know that.
Nearly
feeling.
25 years, and it's gone.
25 you've been in.
Yeah.
All right, that's great. Let's spend a little time talking about the infrastructure of Malmstrom.
Sure.
You told me about your personnel and the number of missiles, 150 of them.
Mm-hmm.
How many square miles is that divided over across?
Well, the entire complex is actually the size of the state of Indiana. It's about 13,800 square miles. Now, that includes the old 564th Missile Squadron that was shut down a few years ago. Our silos, we have 50 silos up there that are empty in caretaker status, and they'll be destroyed as part of the New START Treaty. And then we have 5 missile alert facilities up in that area. But the whole complex, 13,800 square miles, and 3 active missile squadrons.
Okay, now, did you call them launch control centers?
That's right. They're launch control centers are where the 2-person crew reside that would control the missiles.
And each launch control center controls 10 missiles, is that correct?
That's correct. The way the Minuteman system is set up, it's meant to be extremely resilient under nuclear attack. It's meant to survive, and it's meant to allow us to launch whatever remaining missiles there are after we've absorbed several nuclear strikes. And those launch control centers, each one is responsible for 10 launch facilities. And think of a launch facility as a silo. That's what the media typically calls them. So each one of those has 1 missile. They're remotely located from the launch control center, and they're connected together with an underground cabling system called a hardened intersite cabling system. Allows us to send commands back and forth.
Now, how many people in the launch center, how many people need to enter the keys like you see in the nuclear submarine movies, or
Sure.
the protections against false launch? Or
Well, it takes 2 crew members to provide a launch vote, and they have to independently copy, decode, take several other actions to make sure it truly is an order from the President of the United States. And then another crew has to also do the same thing simultaneously at another launch control center. And when you have at least 2 crews that concur and send those electronic votes out, then the missiles are gone, or whatever number were tasked by the President. And 1 crew could do it if if everyone else were destroyed or offline for whatever reason, and if all crews were killed or destroyed in a first strike by an adversary. We do have an airborne capability to launch these as well. The idea being that it's an awfully, awfully, awfully hard target for an adversary to kill, and no one really has the capability to do that anymore except the Russians.
now, the launch, or the silos, I'll use the familiar term.
Sure.
The silos, they have to, during a launch, they have to blow a shield off?
That's right. It's a 110-ton concrete rebar blast door meant to absorb a nearby nuclear strike and allow that missile to survive. The missile in the silo is actually in a tube that's suspended with shock isolators, so it can withstand vibrations. It's a very, very sensitive weapon system, but it can absorb a lot of vibration. And when the crew turns keys, it expends some ordnance that blows the 110-ton concrete blast door off as if it were just the plastic lid off a coffee cup. And then the missile can fly out. The idea behind that blast door is to protect the missile while it's sitting there, but if it's buried in debris from nearby nuclear strike, that blast door can move any amount of debris that's been piled on top of it and still get the missile out of the hole. It's a
Amazing.
very, very powerful capability.
Now, they've cut down the number of warheads allowed. Did you call it a START treaty, or is it the SALT
Yeah, it's
treaty?
a new START treaty.
Okay.
There was SALT when President Nixon was in, and he signed that with Leonid Brezhnev, and then START treaty was signed between Reagan and Gorbachev, and now President Obama and the Russians have signed the new START treaty, and that was signed back in, I believe, 2010. And that allows us to have 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers. And for ICBMs, what that means, for instance, I mentioned the 564th that has empty silos. Well, each silo is considered a launcher. If it's got a missile in it, it's called a deployed launcher. If it has no missile in it, it's called a non-deployed launcher. And so the New START treaty will force us down to certain limits, and one of the things that the U.S. Air Force will do is destroy 50 empty silos at Warren Air Force Base down around Cheyenne that held the old Peacekeeper missile system. And here at Malmstrom, we'll destroy 50 silos that are empty up in the old 564th area that were already empty anyhow.
Yes. Now, the START, didn't a lot of the warheads or the missiles usually carry 5, 6 different warheads? Didn't some of the Soviet missiles have that capability?
Soviet missiles had enormous capability to carry extra warheads, or we call them multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs.
Right.
U.S. Air Force, the big capability the Minuteman III gave us when it went in the ground in 1971 is we could put up to 3 MIRVs on each missile. So each missile was capable of attacking 3 different targets. And the weapon system that the Soviets were extremely fearful of was this old Peacekeeper ICBM system that went in the ground in the 80s. President Reagan, by the way, named it Peacekeeper. It had been called the MX missile, for Missile Experimental. That system carried up to 10 warheads on each missile. So one squadron of 50 ICBMs had 500 targets it could hold at risk. For us, we can put up to 3 on each one of our Minuteman IIIs.
And
so
that's
each
allowed
missile,
by the treaty?
The number of warheads, we are starting to reduce those down to make them a less lucrative target to an adversary.
While we're on that subject, what would be the impact of the reduction in force on Malmstrom, on the community of Great Falls?
Well, it'd be huge if they were to ever shut this base down, because we currently, Malmstrom Air Force Base, being we, provide about 47 to 49% of the local economy. It's huge, $332 million a year that we pump into the economy. And so if the base were to shut down, it'd be vital that Malmstrom or the Great Falls area have some sort of redundancy in their economy to make up for that. And even then, that's quite a stretch to make up $332 million. We have the same question. What impact would there be should we do some sort of a unilateral drawdown? General Kowalski, the commander of our major command, Air Force Global Strike Command, has a theory that I obviously not just agree with. I think it's absolutely right, and that is the missiles are one thing, the silos are another. So in other words, if we want to reduce the number of missiles, we could do that and not impact Malmstrom if we leave the silos alone. And if you think about it, what a capability these silos present, or what they give our country. And the other thing is they present our adversaries with an almost insurmountable targeting problem, because they are stretched out with 150 silos over an area the size of the state of Indiana or West Virginia, Maryland, a pretty good sized state. The adversary has to saturate that area with nuclear weapons to be sure they've gotten everything, so we can't respond. And there are 3 missile bases like that. That's just too much of a target for an adversary to go against. So if we were to pull missiles out of the ground and yet leave those silos intact, we could work on the empty silos, refurbish them, and move the missiles around, sort of a shell game, so we could really reduce the number of missiles. But if we leave those silos in the ground, we still present that targeting problem for the adversary. And in that case, we'd be better off to sort of leave the base alone, I guess. And then it would minimize the economic impact.
So that would be your prediction that Malmstrom will...
I don't know if I'd call it a prediction. That's my hope. If we decide, and I'm not necessarily an advocate for reducing our nuclear weapons unilaterally. I think that there are bad people out in the world, and I think that deterrence really is a matter of a multiplication problem. It's capability times will, equals deterrence in the minds of each one of your adversaries. And as the number of adversaries the United States faces increases, they each think differently, and they certainly each think differently than we do. And it'd be a mistake to have them conceive of our capability or our will in that multiplication problem in a way that drives the deterrence value in their minds down to a point where now all of a sudden they think today is the day we need to attack the United States. In a world of weapons of mass destruction, we can't afford to absorb a Pearl Harbor type strike anymore. We don't have time to take an F-150 plant in Detroit and turn it into a bomber factory like we did in World War II and crank out the military machine we'd need to win World War II. In a world of weapons of mass destruction, how many major U.S. cities could we afford to lose before the American people lose faith in the government? We can't afford to let an adversary think today's the day.
The nuclear triad, is that still in existence, or is it just submarine-launched missiles and the land-launched?
No, we still have the triad, and each leg of that triad is complementary. During the Cold War, we often talked about ICBMs being the responsive leg. In other words, hence our name Minuteman. We're ready to go all the time. This is the one military unit in the U.S. military that is always at war. We are always in the mindset that today is the day we will go to war. So we're constantly ready. But we always thought, well, since everyone knows where each and every one of our silos and launch control centers are, we're very vulnerable to an attack. The submarine force was very survivable because they're underwater. They're very, very hard to track those submarines, if not impossible today, though that could change over time. And they pack a heck of a wallop. But there aren't very many of them. It's a lot of eggs and very few baskets, but they are highly survivable. The bomber leg was very, very visible because when we launch bombers, it makes the news. And the other thing is it gives the president sort of an ability to change his mind after he sent a signal. If the adversary backs down, he can change his mind and bring the bombers home. But it's a very, very slow leg of the triad, uniquely suited for smaller adversaries. Now, the ICBM mission, if you think about where we stand at the end of the Cold War, as I said earlier, only one nation has the ability to attack our ICBM fields with any amount of success, and that's Russia. And if Russia were to do that, they would expend their entire arsenal and leave them vulnerable to a counterstrike from our submarines and our bombers. And so it's not worthwhile for them to pursue an attack on the ICBM fields. No other nation can attack our ICBM fields with any measure of success. And so they are very complementary. If you take one leg out, you've greatly simplified what the adversary has to consider and what sort of weapon systems they would have to develop to come after the United States. And I think it's also important to note for the American public, we often talk about how unrealistic is it that we would ever come under a massive nuclear attack. Well, it's not necessarily the act of an attack an adversary would have to threaten us with, it would be blackmail. So if the United States were ever in a position of inferiority to any one of our adversaries or any of a consortium of those adversaries, the United States could be susceptible to blackmail, backroom deals and so forth, that the American public wouldn't even know were going on, that our government had been forced to negotiate out of a position of weakness. We can't let that happen. And so, a long answer to a short question, but yes, the triad still exists. I firmly believe that it's still worthwhile, and I think that to go away from that concept because, quote, the Cold War is over with is a bad mistake. And it's only advocated for, though, by people who really are not thinking strategically.
Is it similar to the old SAC days where these bombers were always in the air?
Not at all. No, when Strategic Air Command was there, I mean, the chances of a Soviet attack, whatever the percentage of the chances of an attack were, SAC knew they had to have those bombers ready to go at all times. They couldn't afford to have them caught on the ground. And so they instituted what was called Operation Chrome Dome, and B-52s flew around the clock with thermonuclear warheads on until I believe it was the early 70s. And because of the number of accidents they had, they decided to go away from Operation Chrome Dome. But we no longer do that. In fact, the bomber posture is dramatically different from when Strategic Air Command stood down in 1992. First President Bush pulled our bombers off of alert. But even then, they weren't airborne 24 hours a day with bombs on board.
Are these the B-1?
No, the B-1s are no longer a nuclear-capable bomber, and that's why you see them assigned to Air Combat Command as opposed to Air Force Global Strike Command. In Air Force Global Strike Command, we have two strategic bomber systems. One is the B-52 Stratofortress bomber out of Minot Air Force Base and Barksdale Air Force Base, and then we also have the B-2 Stealth bomber out of Whiteman Air Force Base.
Okay, that's the Delta Wing plane?
It is. It looks like a flying bat.
Yeah, it does a good job of conveying that image, doesn't it? The inspection at
Yes.
Maelstrom. There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of rumors. Would you like to shut any of those down? Would you like to address that?
Yeah, let me say what I can about that. First of all, we feel like we let the community down in failing a nuclear surety inspection, and it's unfortunate that we even give the results of a nuclear surety inspection out as far as whether it was a pass-fail, because it really leaves a lot of space for the public to fill in what they think happened. What I can say is we were on pace for a record-setting nuclear surety inspection. In fact, until the very last day, our inspectors were singing our praises over it. It had been the best nuclear surety inspection they have ever seen. Best operations, best maintenance, best personnel reliability program, one best after another. And then they executed a scenario and they simulated something that our airmen do for real at Malmstrom. And they simulated it in a way that confused some of our airmen and caused them to momentarily hesitate as to what they were really seeing and what was expected of them. And because of that slight hesitation, we failed. And the way a nuclear surety inspection is set up, it's meant to induce an enormous amount of pressure on a unit, because we're not at combat or we're not in combat. In a conventional unit, they're actually being shot at when they go over into a hostile environment, and so that induces pressure on you to be sharp as a knife. You know that from your time in Vietnam. For us, we have to induce that pressure artificially, and what better way to do that than make such a high-stakes game pass-fail? It's like an on-off switch. You either pass it or you didn't, and you can have an absolutely flawless inspection, and one very junior person has a slight hesitation and the entire wing fails. And that makes us a very, it's a very stressful thing, but I think it's necessary to impart to our airmen just how important this mission is. But the thing I would tell the American people, especially here in our local community, is you should have absolute faith in Malmstrom regardless of what the headlines said the day after that inspection result was released. It makes me sick that I can't go into the details and explain, because the minute you hear the explanation of what really happened, everybody would be completely at ease, but I can't go into those kind of details. I can say that if it were a real-world event, we would have had absolutely no problem whatsoever. And the way we exercise at Malmstrom is we make the airmen actually go through their actions. The way the Inspector General wanted to do it, they wanted to simulate everything, and that confused them. And the hesitation resulted in our error.
Do you guys get a mulligan here? Are they going to
No,
come back
we won't
and
get a
retest
mulligan.
it?
They will come back and retest us, and that's scheduled 7 through 11 October, but it goes in the books as an unsat rating, and it'll burn a coal. It's like a burning coal in all of our bellies. I can tell you the airmen here are not sad, they're not down, they're mad. And they're ready to go, and I wish the Inspector General could show up today. I wish they could have shown up the day after the unsat rating was given to us. We're ready to go.
Morale, that's a key issue.
It sure is.
It would be natural that they suffer a little accordion effect after a shot like that.
Right.
Because you do have a proud force here and greatly involved with the community. But community-based morale or relations, you feel they're as good here in Great Falls as you've seen in many of your other stations? Or?
Well, you heard my list of bases I've been to. I'd say this is the best I've ever seen, hands down. There's something about this area, and I'd always wanted to be assigned to Malmstrom, in part because there's sort of a mystique about the 341st Missile Wing. Everyone knows it. It's home of the Blanchard Trophy. Granted, Minot has it right now, and we're not going to be able to fight to get that back this fall because the sequestration and the budget cuts, the Global Strike Challenge was canceled for this year. But Malmstrom is known for being a base that wins. And people love it up here. And a lot of that is just flat out, it becomes your home. And the relationship we have with the city of Great Falls and the counties that support our missile field is so strong that you have people that come up here and then they stay. They retire in this area. And that sends a powerful signal. It tells a story. And it's a great base. It's a good place to be.
What can you do to strengthen the bonds between the community and the base? I know you have a lot of your airmen and officers out volunteering in the community.
Right.
What would improve that? More volunteer operations or opportunities? What can the community do?
Well, I tell you, there are a couple of things they're already doing, and there's a Warren Wentz's wife. I don't know if you know Warren, but his wife Sue proposed a program similar to what we have at the Air Force Academy, where families from downtown adopt an airman. And so here you've got to imagine, here we have 4,000 people brought into this base, really 8,000 when you count their families. So 8,000 people on Malmstrom Air Force Base, and they come from Miami, Florida, they come from Spokane, Washington, they come from Indianapolis, Indiana. And sometimes this can feel like the surface of the moon to somebody that's from a big city. And so what better way to make them better servants for their U.S. Air Force and for the country and for this community than to make them feel like this is their home? And so the program is called Great Friends, Great Falls. And we're just getting ready to kick it off. We've got all the legal work done and all those sorts of things. And what we will do is have a list of families downtown that are willing to adopt an airman, and we'll have a list of airmen who are interested in that. And the idea is to get our airmen off this base and get out there and just see how wonderful this community and this area is. And I think that will go miles and miles toward making our airmen's morale better and also improving our relations with the city. And I've also put up a couple of signs as you leave the base that have our Air Force logo on it. It's the last thing an airman sees when he exits Malmstrom Air Force Base. And it says, "You are now an ambassador for the United States Air Force." They have to realize, and they have to understand that when they go downtown, they are representing not just us at Malmstrom, but the entire U.S. Air Force to the citizens of this area. And we raised our right hands to protect this great nation, and you can't do that when you're downtown causing trouble. So I want to remind them one last time, when they're off on their own, that they're our ambassadors.
You know, I've got a lot of unanswered questions here. Unfortunately, our time has pretty much slipped away. Do you have any final thoughts for this? And I'd love to come back and continue this at a different date if you can work it into your busy schedule.
You bet. You bet.
Any parting thoughts here?
Well, again, I want to make sure people understand that the mission of Malmstrom Air Force Base is to prevent World War III. And so it appears oftentimes that you may have a base full of people like Maytag repairmen sitting out here. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have to keep those 150 Minuteman III ICBMs ready to launch at all times. And it's important that even though most Americans don't even know we exist, there is one large group of people who do know we exist, and that's our nation's adversaries. And our staring at them constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, knowing that we could eliminate an enemy civilization in 30 minutes if they crossed a line that threatened our national sovereignty, keeps them from threatening that national sovereignty. That's our mission, is to prevent World War III.
I thank you, Colonel Rob Stanley, a wing commander at the 341st Command out here. Thank you again.
My honor. Thank you very much, sir.
On Point continues to air every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. on Montana Public Radio, KGPR, Great Falls. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future shows, please contact me, Roger McConnell, at 406-799-6709 or an email onpointkgpr@bresnan.net.